Of Bangor Daily Brews, a new event series that we're doing here at the Bangor Daily News. My name's Matt Junker. I'm the assistant editorial page editor at the paper. Moderating today's discussion is Susan Young, the editor of the opinion pages. You probably met Kimberly Scholes, who is checking folks in at the door, and Joellen Easton is our director of audience engagement, and then Robert Easton here is behind the camera, making sure that we get video from tonight's event. So what we're here to talk about is Maine's referendum process. As an editorial board, we've been focusing on a lot of issues, but four in particular: workforce here in Maine, climate change, cost of rural living, and the fourth is Maine's referendum process. And we've been following the events in Augusta. Maybe not as closely as we should, but pretty closely, hopefully. And like we have some legislators here in the audience who I think are hopefully going to talk to us a bit in the Q&A portion as well. But we've been looking at ways to, potentially make the process work a little bit better and following some of the proposals. And you're going to hear about that tonight. And we're going to start with about 20 minutes or so of discussion with the panel, and then open it up to Q&A. And the whole purpose of these events are audience participation and more of a discussion rather than a presentation. So we hope you all will not shy away from sharing your thoughts and maybe even pushing back a little bit from what you hear up at the panel. We are hoping to focus pretty specifically on the process itself. So maybe not, the politics behind individual people's vetoes or past referendums. Hoping that the conversation can center on the process itself. But to start, we're going to get an update from the League of Women Voters. From Val Kelly is going to give us an update on a study that the League is currently doing, looking into this process itself. So we're not the only ones looking at this. The legislature isn't the only ones looking at this. The League is looking at it as well, and we're excited to hear from them what's going on. If you didn't see, there's a handout from the League that has some great information, just sort of, some frequently asked questions about the process. That's up for, actually it's out back now, I think, back with Kimberly, if anybody wants a copy. But other than that, I'm going to turn it over to Val, and then once she's done, we're going to turn it over to the panel, and after that, we're going to turn it over to everybody else. So hope everybody came ready to chat.
I'll stand up. I can see everybody. Is this working? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I want to thank the Bangor Daily News, first of all, for giving us this opportunity to talk a little bit about the study that we're doing. That's better?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not used to this. We're right in the middle of the study now, so we really don't have any firm conclusions, but an opportunity to tell you about it and to suggest that you can follow us on the website and through our newsletters is well received by the League. Since 1996, the League has been involved in 3 citizens' initiatives and 2 people's vetoes, so we do have some experience with the process. Our decision to do a study of Maine's initiative and referendum process was not based on any preconceived notion that we really do need to reform the process. The choice of topic was motivated more by the League's recognition that there are a lot of bills before the legislature trying to reform the process, and we want to be part of that conversation. Before the League can advocate one way or another on different issues, we have to do a study, and we have to get buy-in from all of our member units. So we decided that this was the time to do a study on the initiative process. And we are hoping that by the end of the year we will be able to come up with a position statement or different position statements on a lot of the issues before the legislature. Okay, we've had a 5-member study committee which began in November 2018. The goal has been to conduct a comprehensive review of the history, the processes, uses, restrictions, and financing of the citizen initiative, legislation, and referendum. As with all League studies, we research information from a variety of reliable sources. We try to get balanced sources to inform membership about the strengths and weaknesses of the process as it exists now, alternative processes, and pros and cons of different proposals that are being put forth for reform. We finished the underlying research, and now we're preparing the report, and we're preparing a list of consensus questions to give to our membership units so they can discuss and debate in local units and then give feedback to the state board and to the study group on where they think the league should go with their advocacy in the future. What I'd like to do is run through, there's 6 particular areas that we have picked that we think merit investigation, and I think these are going to be some of the same issues that our panel discusses today. The first one is the relationship between direct democracy, represented by citizen-initiated legislation, and representative democracy, which legislates through elected representatives. We had a democracy forum discussion about this topic on Wero FM. I don't know if any of you ever followed that, but there's a podcast available, and it goes back through the history of initiative and referendum in the U.S. and particularly in Maine. Okay, the second topic is adequacy and accessibility of government assistance available to citizens wanting to file petitions and to launch a citizens initiative. This includes an evaluation of current rules for filing an application, as well as the adequacy of information provided about those rules, and the types of assistance offered to encourage clear, concise drafts of the proposed legislation. The third topic is adequacy and accessibility of information available to voters on the ballot, questions that they are asked to judge. This includes discussion of what information should go on the petition, on the ballot, in the Citizens Guide, also how the Citizens Guide should be distributed, and whether or not we need to consider changes in the way the pro and con statements are developed for the Citizens Guide. The fourth topic is signature collection and verification rules. The question underlying this discussion is what is the minimum set of rules needed to ensure voter confidence in the process without unduly raising costs and putting the process out of reach for the ordinary citizen. Also, under this topic is the question of whether or not signatures on petitions should be held to the same standards of representativity as a normal vote, as for representatives or president or something like that. Campaign finance is the fifth topic, and it covers views on the lack of contribution ceilings for ballot questions, role of out-of-state funding, adequacy of the Ethics Commission data and summaries on contributions and expenditures on particular ballot questions. I know this is a topic that Maine Heritage has worked on a lot, so there should be overlap there. The very last topic we're dealing with is faithful and transparent implementation of voter-approved citizen initiatives. This includes a discussion of the rights of the legislature to repeal, amend, and ignore legislation. We hope to, I already said this, we hope to finish by the end of the year. In the meantime, we've posted a number of 1 to 2 page interim briefs on our website, one of which is being circulated here tonight. And we're also sending out periodic newsletters to our membership. If anybody here is interested in being added to that email list or wants more information about what's on the website, please talk to me after the panel discussion. So thanks again for giving me this opportunity to talk about our study, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Val. It was a great update. I also want to just quickly thank Nocturnem for hosting us. And the guy in the red shirt, the manager, is Zach, is the one who's taking all your orders, so we appreciate his work jumping around the room as we chat here. Also, obviously, just want to thank all of you for coming. Thank everyone who's a BDN subscriber. You literally make our work possible. And before we get to the panel, just want to give you a quick heads up of some other events the BDN has coming down the pike. On August 14th, there's going to be a listening session at the Belfast Public Library, and then we're also going to have a discussion about the Me Too movement in Maine on August 21st at the Bangor Arts Exchange. So just a couple other, not Bangor Daily Brews events, but other BDN events that are coming down the pike. But now, with no further ado, to our panel. We have Jake Posik, who is the Communications Director from the Maine Heritage Policy Center, and Carroll Conley, who is the Executive Director of the Christian Civic League of Maine. And they're going to be chatting with Susan. And I think I've done enough talking, so I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thanks, Matt. I'm Susan Young. I'm the Bangor Daily News editorial page editor, and just quickly want to thank all of you for coming tonight and joining in this discussion. And thanks again, especially to our subscribers. You help pay us, so keeping journalism alive, which we really appreciate. And also thanks again to Nocturnem. Thank you. For hosting us, but without further ado, I think we want to jump right in to the discussion. And so, playing off of Val's report and update on what the League of Women Voters is doing, Jake, 2 years ago or a year ago, Maine Heritage Policy Center also did a review of the direct democracy citizen initiative process in Maine, and you guys had some criticisms of the system. So I wonder if you could just quickly, give us your summary of your report.
So the real purpose of the report was to examine some of what Val had just mentioned, some of the restrictions that exist on the process in Maine today, what other states do, and then the influence of money within the process itself. Where does it come from? How much money is actually contributed? And finding averages. We only looked at data within years that electronic data was available within the Maine Ethics Commission. I'm going to try not to get too far into the weeds here. I live in the weeds, unfortunately, but the real purpose of the report was that we know when you go on MaineCampaignFinance.com or followthemoney.org is another one that a lot of people use, they double count contributions. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have two organizations that are both registered with Maine Ethics Commission to support a ballot initiative. So group one gets a contribution from an out-of-state group, and then they give a portion of that money to group two. What we did is we made it so we're not double counting those funds, because if you aggregate contributions, you'll see that the money came to group one and then it sent it to group two, and even though it was that same amount of money, it's being counted twice when you aggregate the contributions. So what we wanted to do was devise a plan really to prevent that from happening, so we could get a clear picture of how much money has actually been contributed to these initiatives over the years, and as I mentioned before, the restrictions on the process. So really what we found is that a lot of the restrictions that you see in other places don't exist in Maine, whether it be subject restrictions that either prevent specific topics from appearing as ballot initiatives or prevent initiatives from encompassing more than one subject. And then the other big one is signature distribution requirements, geographic distribution requirements. How many states employ rules that require petitioning groups to collect signatures in diverse geographical areas? So that was that half of the report. The other half of the report was, as I mentioned, the funding. Where does this money come from? Do you want me to elaborate on that a little more, or you think we'll get into it?
I think we'll get into it. I want to get to a little more specifics about what you found in the report. Your boss, Matt Gagnon, called Maine's referendum process horribly broken. I mean, is that a bit of hyperbole? Do we need to throw the whole process out and start over, or are there more small tweaks? We've seen you have some were before the legislature, one actually got enacted, but is there some other small tweaks, or?
So I think it is broken, but I don't think that it being broken means that we have to undo it. And MHPC does not advocate for totally undoing the referendum process. We've never put in legislation to do that. Really what we want to do are make those tweaks on the margins, as you just mentioned, and I brought up a couple of them just a moment ago. Subject restrictions that make it so the initiative itself is only encompassing one area of public policy. That makes it much easier for voters to understand what they're voting on, because you only get a one-sentence question that appears on your ballot. So if you have an incredibly complex public policy, the best example I can think of is probably the universal home care issue last year. That is trying to change labor law as it relates to, or I should say it was trying to change labor law. It was trying to establish a new universal health care program, universal home care program, my apologies. And it's hard to get all of that, down into just one sentence and have everybody understand it. The kicker is that it was also trying to change tax policy. It was trying to impose new taxes on earners over a certain threshold. So you have complex tax policy being debated in a question, along with major labor reforms on top of establishing a new healthcare system. So it was very convoluted and difficult, I think, to get something like that dissected down to one single sentence. So that's kind of, as it relates to our report and what we found, the money that comes in to the state of Maine for these citizen initiatives comes largely from outside of Maine. I believe the finding in our report was about 71% of all funds donated to ballot initiative campaigns between 2009 and 2017 came from outside of Maine. And that's not to say that we believe that outside groups shouldn't be able to contribute to Maine's referendum process. What it really means is that how we want the process to run? Are there changes that we can make that would minimize that influence and make it so Mainers have more of a voice in what's going on versus outside interest groups? Like I said, 71% of the funds came from outside sources once we eliminated the double counting phenomenon. And I think that is troubling. Like I said, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed to contribute or play a role in our process, but when you have these initiatives being run, not entirely, but a lot of them are, if you look at the findings in our report, you'll see that there are some initiatives where 100% of the funding came from outside of Maine. Not one single Mainer contributed their own money for an initiative to appear on a ballot, and I think that's not how the process was ever intended to be, and I think that's really what the purpose of that report was to show. I think, everybody has problems one way or another with outsiders trying to influence your election. So I think that if we do make some of those tweaks on the margin, that we can reduce the outside influence of the influence of outside groups and bring more Mainers into the fold.
I want to bring Carroll into the conversation. You're talking, Jake, more about what we think of as the traditional referendum process, where a group puts something on the ballot to ask voters whether they want to approve it or not. And this year we are facing an unprecedented 12 potential people's vetoes, which are another form of citizen initiative where people circulate petitions to get enough signatures to have a question go on the ballot to reverse something, a law that has been passed by the legislature. So the Secretary of State has approved 12 questions for signature gathering. That doesn't mean they will all appear on the ballot in November, possibly March, or even in June, but those are folks are going to be out there gathering signatures. Carroll, you have 2 that you're working on. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the money question. What kind of organization does it take? How much money do you need? What's the process to gather the signatures to launch a campaign?
Well, this is the first time I became the director in 2010, so this is the first veto that we've been part of in years. And I think it is true that you have the 90 days, so it is different in how much money you can raise and how much influence you can have. We as an organization, I think it's, when you talk about outside money, I think it's a legitimate question. What is the intention? What are we trying to do? And in this particular process, I don't see as much outside money coming. I think that has to do with the fact that it's such a local issue, and some of the changes have occurred as far as, whether you can pay signature gatherers and those. The two issues that we're dealing with are really grassroots efforts. And that doesn't mean that we don't have consultants and that we have people in different parts of the state. I'm guessing, for instance, our two issues that we're involved in, it's going to cost about $100,000 to $120,000 to gather those 65,000 signatures for each of those, the two that we're involved in. And the vast majority of that, and I don't know of any outside money that's coming in. Now, if someone wants to write a check from the outside, see me afterwards. But I think because it's a veto, because it's a reaction against the legislature, and just for the record, I know we'll be talking about these things. I don't think it should be easy. I think that if I'm a fan of representative government, and so we do have this process, and we are taking advantage of it. But for the citizen, and I would also say even for the Christian Civic League as an organization, it should be difficult. It should be a huge task, and it should be absolutely verified all along the way.
Along those lines, Jake, you mentioned that you focused more on having multiple issues kind of disguised as one question, but you also mentioned perhaps there shouldn't be specific issues that aren't dealt with through the citizen initiative process. And Carroll, you're aware that folks have been frustrated in the past that we've handled some civil rights issues, some rights for minority groups where we're asking the majority to decide how those rights, whether they should be extended or not. So I wonder if both of you can give your perspectives on the question of whether there are certain issues that should not go out to the citizens, that shouldn't be handled through the referendum process.
I don't know if anything directly comes to mind. What worries me, and I think our organization as well, is trying to decide complex tax policy at the ballot box, just because it's really easy to say that this person makes too much or this person makes too little, so we need to hike taxes at the ballot box. Outside of that, I don't really think that there are any specific issues that are, shouldn't be allowed to appear on the ballot. I think really for us, like I said before, what really worries us is trying to decide tax policy. As it relates to subject restrictions, I don't know if it should be any specific one subject, but I do think that there is value in making it so a question only encompasses one issue. If you think back to, I already used the example, but the Universal Home Care Initiative, that question didn't say anything about making Medicare providers employees for the purpose of the State Employees Labor Relations Act. That appeared nowhere on your ballot, and unless you really started digging into the question, you wouldn't know why that was tied into it. My hunch is that the backers of that wanted to assemble in Maine a dues skimming operation similar to what you see in other states. But I think if we just keep these issues or keep the questions to one issue that can be easily understood in one single sentence on a ballot, we would be best off.
I think Val's study certainly addressed some of that issue, like what is the information that is available to the voters, not just to the folks that are, gathering the signatures or involved in the campaign. And it's kind of frustrating because there is some fantastic information through the Secretary of State's office, but it does cost money to get information out to individuals and to educate people. And so I don't know what further either responsibilities or just interest that the government has to be involved in disseminating that information as opposed to just saying, hey, it's on, on the website. Because really that information, I've had some issues with Matt and some of the questions and how, obviously we weren't happy about a couple of things, but I think the Secretary of State is trying to, go down the middle and simply make that information available. But I think part of that would be, the people of Maine would benefit from that in-depth information regardless of where they stand on the issues. So I think if it is going to be, the whole argument, representative democracy, whatever, there's no question that more information is available. And if it truly is going to be a citizens' initiative, and we are trying to understandably keep outside influences, then maybe the government needs to play a larger role in disseminating that information rather than just putting it on a website.
Yeah, I would just point out the voter guides that you're referring to are very helpful on the Secretary of State's website, so I'm sure you guys are all aware of that. But to that point, the legislature did pass a bill to include the fiscal note with referendums in the future, but one of the arguments against it from the Secretary of State's office was that it could make the ballot longer, and therefore there was an increased cost to the state for printing the ballot. We acknowledge that argument, but somewhat disagreed and felt that it was important to get the fiscal note information out there as another form of voter education about referendums, and we will see that in the future.
I don't want to get fired, but I don't think that bill passed.
You're right, it did not. It was a different bill.
There was a bill to require a committee hearing. But
That's right.
The fiscal note bill did not pass.
Okay, so we will have a little bit more information through a committee hearing before the legislature. As you know, all of these go through the legislature. They can pass them or put them out to referendum, but sometimes they have not held hearings, which seems pretty egregious to us. At minimum, you want the public to be able to come and testify on these proposals. Jake, I just want to push back a little bit. You said that tax policy isn't something that should be decided through citizens referendum, but if memory serves, which Matt has pointed out, it doesn't always isn't always accurate. Maine Heritage Policy Center was supportive of the Tabor initiatives a while ago, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is clearly a tax issue. So that causes a lot of people to say, well, conservatives don't like referendums because their referendums tend not to be successful. So this is just sour grapes on you guys' part, complaining that the process is too hard because it appears that the liberals are better at using it. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
So I should have clarified, I should have said tax increases, not tax policy. No, to your point about the sour grapes, I think, I understand it, you see people saying that sort of stuff on social media all the time, but I think to me it's somewhat of a superficial analysis, because if you look at what the legislature accomplished this year, a Democratic-controlled legislature in the state of Maine, they passed two really important ballot initiative reforms. We just mentioned one, the public hearing bill. For the last 8 years, there wasn't a single public hearing, with the exception of question one in 2017, the casino in York County. There were no public hearings. That is the kind of reform that simply makes the process better. We're not inhibiting what can appear on the ballot. It's simply making the process more digestible for the public, and it increases transparency. So that was one of the big ones. And then the other one was LD 534, which requires these questions to be written as simply as is possible, is the language in the bill. And then it also requires for a statement describing what a yes and what a no vote means. And to your point before about adding additional cost, it is possible that adding those after every question could require the printing of an additional ballot. I think the cost is somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000 to $200,000 if they are forced to do that, which I think is personally a pretty low cost to ensure that people have confidence in what's on their ballot and understanding what they're voting for. But to your point about the sour grapes, as I mentioned before, I think it's a superficial analysis, because the composition of the legislature, it's controlled by Democrats, and if you look at these bills, they went under the hammer. There wasn't even rigorous debate about these. These are common sense reforms, I think, that anybody can get behind. So you're right that liberal organizations have had more success in recent years at these, but I really think we can all get behind reforms that make the process better. And I think that LD 1209, the public hearing bill, and LD 534, which requires them to be written as simply as possible and explain what a yes or no vote means, those are common sense reforms that we should all be in support of.
And one reform that's brought up frequently is a change in distribution requirements for signatures. I mean, we saw that especially with ranked choice voting, especially after the 2nd district race. A lot of folks felt that Southern Maine foisted ranked choice voting upon the 2nd district. At least that was the narrative, after the ranked choice counting. So I wonder if both of you can talk about what you think about, we can't do it on a per county basis because that's not one person, one vote, but we could do it by congressional district, perhaps state senate district, but that gives you an awful lot of tabulation to do, but that's just talk about that reform because it comes up year after year.
You want Carroll to go first?
Yeah, I would say the Senate district probably makes more sense, but is certainly more arduous. There's no question. But I think that when you get when you consider that particular issue, I think that we as an organization, as far as our mission is concerned, we don't have positions regarding, the process is here, as long as it's here, we will take advantage of it. But as an observer, just experientially, I think it makes sense to do something that York County and Cumberland County, not driving something for Northern Maine and vice versa. So some type of disbursement based upon Senate districts, I think actually does make a lot of sense. I also probably would like to see it up to around 15% rather than 10%.
I don't think we are interested in increasing the threshold in terms of the number of signatures required. You got to get a little over 60,000 to be certified, and most groups go get 70 or 75 to make sure you get enough certified, because there's going to be some that get thrown out, duplicates and what have you. I think in terms of the numerical threshold, we're fine. I don't think that's what needs to change. I'm a huge proponent of the geographic distribution requirements, and you're right, we can't do it by county. The congressional district method has been upheld. There was a court challenge to this in Nevada that was upheld. I don't know if any state has gone the state senate district route, so I don't know if that's been challenged or not. It would certainly make it more difficult. I would say at the bare minimum, both congressional districts should have equal say in what's on the ballot. And I haven't seen an analysis done of all the questions, but I know Mr. David Trahan of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine has done some analyses on some of the questions that his group opposed, and I think it was the bear baiting issue and the universal background checks in 2016, and found that for those two initiatives that his group opposed, the more than 70% came from, I can't remember if it was the 1st congressional district or the greater Portland area, but the bulk of the signatures were gathered there. So really how we feel is that we just think that people in both areas should be should have say in what appears on your ballot. I don't think it should be driven entirely by one section of the state or one area of the state. And for me, kind of the reason why is because the whole theory of the two Maines is pretty well documented, Maine, or the north-south dichotomy, whatever you want to call it. But the political ideologies of people in northern and southern Maine are different. So I think to ensure that the questions that appear on our ballot actually reflect the policy ambitions of all Maine people, you should at least be required to go up to Lewiston, Auburn, or Bangor to get some support for some of these initiatives.
We're going to open it up to your questions fairly quickly, but I want to ask a question about, are we coming about this completely backwards? Is the problem, as was mentioned earlier, that the legislature doesn't always follow the will of the people, even through the initiative process? We've seen ballot measures legalizing marijuana, others that were passed by the public, but then the legislature either ignored them or watered them down or dragged their feet to implement them. So is there a larger problem at the legislative level that referendums are being passed but then either gutted or ignored? And what do we do about that?
I think that gets into are you a statesman or, are you a weather vane? And even, there's some good friends in here that I walk the halls with that I don't agree with on a lot of things, but I respect the fact that You know, I think of my good friend David Burns, you know, Senator Burns down in Washington County. He was against the casino in Washington County, and he told his people that were, I think they were 80% in charge of it, but he said, I know you've elected me, but I have a conviction about this. I don't think it's in our county's best interest. And David was reelected because he'd said, you know, they could have thrown him out, but he was honest about it. But as a statesman, he voted his conscience. And I personally don't think that politicians and representatives should just necessarily be a thermometer. And so and then the voters then can decide. No, we want someone that is going to either 80% of the 90% of the time. And I think that's an interesting balance. The idea of democracy and the representative government, I think that this is just another added layer. If someone takes a stand that is not popular or within their district, then the veto process and the referendum is a way for the people to speak.
But what about when the legislature as a whole, not an individual lawmaker, but the entire legislature, does not fulfill the requirements of a referendum?
Then there's a consequence still, the next election process to do that. And again, I understand why that may be offensive, but there are times that, I know it sounds elitist, but there may have been information or better time for the legislators to take an action that really did not come to play in that particular time when there was a referendum. I mean, I'll use the marijuana as an example, and I know this is going to sound like sour grapes, but the information that we have now the last 2 years from like Harvard University and things like that, there's so much more information that may have caused the legislature to, I know that's one reason they delayed these last 2 years, is because of more information. Now, like I said, they will implement, but I think it's absolutely appropriate for people to act as statesmen.
So I don't think it's inappropriate for the legislature to change or undo, and there's really two reasons why. As Carroll just mentioned, we're a representative democracy. People go to Augusta to vote on our behalves on issues. I don't think there's any way that we could legally prevent them from doing whatever they want to do, quite frankly. Number two, my big problem with that in terms of why is the legislature undoing these things, to me it goes back to the issue of not holding a public hearing. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that Maine has an indirect initiative process. So when a petition is certified, it doesn't go straight to voters. It becomes an initiated bill that the legislature can act on before it gets sent to voters. So if the legislature isn't holding a public hearing and not learning about the bill, then the language behind the question that appears on your ballot was written by some sort of special interest group. So I think that if the legislature actually held public hearings, like they should, in my opinion, and then proposed competing measures as they are able to through the Maine Constitution, we would actually get better questions that appear on our ballot. Regardless of what you think about the merits of any of the questions that we've seen on our ballot in recent years, there's countless examples of how the legislature could have improved the language before the question appeared on our ballot. Think back to marijuana. There was, I believe, an AG opinion that said that under the original language of the law, children would be allowed to use marijuana. With ranked choice voting, I know proponents of ranked choice voting want it to be applied to general elections within the state, but if the legislature held a public hearing and put forward a competing measure that just struck that section of the law, we would have saved ourselves a massive headache, a massive time suck, and money wasted, essentially, at the legislative level, trying to redo, undo, delay it over and over and over again. So I think if the legislature, and I know there's gridlock in Augusta, and it's hard to do, and they're always going right up to adjournment, and it's easier said than done, which I totally understand. But if the legislature held public hearings and took the duty of proposing competing measures seriously, I think 90% of the problems that people have with the ballot initiative process would be cleared up. And there's only been two, I think, since like 1970-something. There's only been two competing measures. And as I mentioned before, the practice of holding the public hearing, we've only had one since 2011. So if we hold public hearings, if legislators propose competing measures, I think we'd be a lot better off. And you wouldn't see the legislature undoing or delaying or doing whatever they do to change or undo an initiative after it's passed.
I just want to jump in because you raise an interesting point about constitutionality. I mean, should we have a system where we make sure that questions pass constitutional muster before we ask voters to vote on them? We saw with ranked choice voting that there were some constitutional issues, and that question obviously needed to be changed. But if we had had that debate perhaps before it went to the voters, we could have had a different outcome.
Yeah, I think we do, but the problem is that you got to be really, it's tricky how to pass that through law, because you can't use the term unconstitutional, because the only person who can determine if something's unconstitutional is a court. So what we were grappling with this session, which ultimately didn't come to be, unfortunately, but Beth O'Connor had sponsored a bill, Representative Beth O'Connor sponsored a bill that would have essentially done that. And really the way that we wanted to go about it was to get a non-binding opinion from the Attorney General, because legislators can, as I understand it anyway, they can ask for these things on bills, and they do quite often. So why not let that same process occur within the ballot initiative process? As I mentioned before, you can't use the word unconstitutional because it can only be determined by a court. But if you get the AG during the application process to review the language and determine, does any of this potentially conflict with the Maine Constitution or the U.S. Constitution? If no, you got the green light. And here's the thing is that even if it doesn't, I don't think that it necessarily can be undone or be prevented from appearing on the ballot, but having that step where at least the AG can issue that opinion for the public to know before this appears on the ballot. Our AG thinks this section of the law is unconstitutional, or our AG thinks that this is totally A-OK and there's no real problem.
I agree that that's an important minimal step that should be implemented. And again, with our legislators dealing with 2,400 bills per session, it's insane. I had no idea before I took this job, like how crazy it is down there. And one thing that you hear a lot, that somehow, I don't know how we can change this dialogue, but to address having better referendum questions coming out and more informed, I hear a lot when we put this to legislators or friends in private conversation, they'll say, well, it's sacrosanct. You don't want to go against the will of the voters, but they'll gut a bill. But if we actually do these competing measures, somehow if we can change the dialogue and the narrative that this isn't going against the voters, but you're actually serving the voters better by doing that. I don't know how that happens, but I think that would, I totally agree that would enhance the process.
We want to broaden the discussion to get to your questions. So Matt, I believe, has a microphone, and we would appreciate it if you could say who you are when you ask your question. But let's open it up and continue this discussion.
Anybody just raise your hand if you want to.
My name is Henry Lanford, and I live in Bangor. It just seems to me that the two potentially confrontational things that have come up, one has to do with financing these campaigns, and the other has to do with the geographical representation. It just seems to me, let me ask a question. Let's imagine that there is some issue that's of great concern to the potato growers in northeastern Worcester County, and they really feel strongly about it. Why? And this is an issue that will be voted for if the referendum exists. It will be voted on by the whole state. Why does it not make sense for them to be allowed to get all those farmers to sign that petition and let the whole state decide the issue later on?
Thanks for the question. Any thoughts? Sure.
Just because. To me, it's a statewide process. It's a statewide initiative. I think the whole state should have a say in what appears on our ballot, not just what is passed, but what appears on the ballot. There's a lot of different steps in the ballot initiative process, and to me, really the reason why is kind of, if you look at the inverse, I guess, on what I mentioned before with some of the analyses that Sam had done. I don't think it's up to voters in just one region of the state what should or shouldn't appear on the ballot. I think just as you have to pass them with support statewide, they should get on the ballot with support statewide. Now, there's still nothing that prevents the petitioning group in your situation from collecting however many signatures they want from all the potato farmers up there. But I still think that they should get buy-in from another region of the state. I think it's just fair and equitable, to be honest, to ensure that whether it's the front end of the process or the back end of the process, that the whole state has buy-in.
And again, theoretically, what you're saying, I understand, but there will be very few issues that don't have implications for everybody beyond the farmer. I mean, what if you had the potato growers that were making vodka with potatoes, but you've got the wheat guys that are, doing it somewhere else, making the grain vodka, and the issue is trying to give some type of financial relief for the farmers that are doing the potato vodka. So I think that I understand your question, but when it comes to these type of issues, I think there are very few things that are going to be just germane and not be affected by a state all over, whether it's Portland or Aroostook County.
I would just jump in and say we actually have a real-world example of this. We don't need to talk about hypotheticals. We've had a lot of casino questions on the ballot, and obviously, a casino affects the community that it's in more strongly than other communities. And we've had some casinos that have been passed by voters, including one in Bangor, but the tribes have had multiple efforts to get a casino approved, and it's kind of like your example. It's a local group that feels really strongly this is going to be important economic development for them, and they really want this, but the large group of voters across the state continues to say no. So that's a real-world example of kind of this scenario you're talking about, and I don't know what that tells us, if that changes your answers at all, but it shows that there are some issues that are really hard to handle through this process.
If I could just jump in, I would say in the situation that you provided, to me that would be a local initiative, you know what I mean? Now, if it's a statewide rule, of course you couldn't undo it at the local level, but there is also local initiatives, and there actually was a bill that, not to get a little too far off topic, but actually allows those initiatives to be lettered instead of numbered, so you don't actually see 2 question 1s and you don't know which one is which, but there's nothing that prevents that from being a local initiative too instead of a statewide initiative. That was really my only point there.
Quick follow-up before we go to the next question?
Nothing that you've said really convinces me that there's any real reason why it has to have wide geographic representation to be on the ballot. Yes to vote, but to be on the ballot. I don't hear, none of that, it just sounded like arm waving.
Again, what I would say is that the Citizens Initiative process is supposed to reflect the policy ambitions of Maine people, not just Maine people in one section of the state. Just like, I almost feel like I'm repeating myself, and I don't mean to, but I think that there needs to be statewide buy-in on both sides of the equation. To pass an initiative, you need majority support, and I think that the whole statewide, and I think that the whole state should have a say in what issues appear on the ballot. To me, it's just an issue of fairness and giving everybody a voice in the process. To me, it's increasing engagement in the ballot initiative process. I think the way it is right now, it's too easy to pursue issues that only appeal to one certain group of people or people in one section of the state. I think there should be statewide buy-in on both sides of the equation.
All right, who's next?
Thank you. My name is Nicole Grahowski, and I live in Ellsworth, which is, as everyone probably in this room is aware, is part of CD2. And I just want to offer another look at that difference between collecting signatures in CD1 and CD2, because I know that's often the reform that's presented, not the Senate district reform. I have petitioned in CD2, and I wonder if either the organization, SAM, or Maine Heritage Policy Center has considered the number of places in rural Maine that offer a public opportunity for gathering signatures. I live in Ellsworth, and we have, a main street that people do walk on sometimes, but almost everything else is private property. I petitioned in Bangor and found that one of my only places was downtown. If you go to the movie theater, that's off limits. Bangor Mall is off limits. So I would argue that one of the reasons that there are fewer signatures gathered in CD2 is because it's just, frankly, hard to find the people and the concentration of people. Additionally, I'm aware that Massachusetts has passed a regulation that says any place that the public is welcome, a petitioner is welcome. So those people in Massachusetts can actually go into the mall and ask people for signatures. So I would like to see the groups that are advocating for this to actually do a geographic analysis of the accessibility to the voter that a petitioner has, because I think that's a huge difference between a metropolitan area and a rural area.
Carroll, can you speak to that as someone who has gathered signatures and is currently doing that?
Yeah, and our strategy on the two issues that we're doing primarily, and then another one that we're cooperating with, is not so much going directly to the streets. So a lot of our gathering is around events, and we're finding this has changed in the culture with fairs and things like that. That dynamic is changing. So a lot of what we're doing is with the Catholic and the evangelical churches, where people are already gathered that are probably philosophically aligned with the issue. So wouldn't have run into that, the difference between CD1 and CD2, because we already have come to the conclusion that those challenges exist as far as working in the public and in the streets. So trying to create events where people are already aligned with you that would agree with you.
And I don't think that we would, as it relates to your point of public spaces, I don't think that we would oppose that. I don't see any reason why. It'd be one thing if it was private property, and I understand that, but anywhere where the public is allowed, I think I can get behind that. But I would also say that I understand it's going to be harder in rural Maine or even in CD2 versus CD1, but I also don't think that the process should necessarily cater to what's easy. As Carroll had mentioned before, I think that these should be kind of at least somewhat difficult to get on the ballot, because I don't think the process was ever intended for us to have 6 or 7 of these every single year. And I think that speaks a lot to, as we mentioned before, some of the outside influence and professional petitioning groups and people who are running these operations now in Maine. So I'm behind the public spaces, but I also think that, as I mentioned, there does need to be, it can't be, I think, as easy as it is right now.
Is there a danger if we make it more difficult that we're shutting some groups out?
Yes, this is one that we've grappled with quite a bit. Just like you can overregulate business and hurt an industry, yes, you can go too far and make the process too difficult for groups to get on the ballot, which is why, as I mentioned from the top, we're not interested in increasing the threshold to make it 15 or 20% instead of 10%. I think the 10% threshold is fine. I think it's just a matter of what can we do on the margins of the process to improve it. Making sure voters know what they're voting on, holding public hearings so information is disseminated and open to the public and can be consumed easily, and ensuring that people in both congressional districts have a say in what appears on the ballot. I think those are the most important reforms, and I don't really know how much further after that you have to go.
I agree. I think the financial aspect of it probably is the most important, and because I do believe this should be a citizens' initiative. I really don't think it should just be what is behind financially or who you can afford to hire to do that. I don't know how you can totally take that out, but I agree, even though I do think it should be more difficult than it is now, and it is difficult, I can tell you, going through that. But I really do think that the financial piece, and I think that I applaud what the legislature attempted to do in several areas, especially paying people for, some of those laws and attempts to try to take the money out of the actual signature gathering.
I think we have some more questions in the back.
Quick follow-up from Nicole, and then I'm going to put a moratorium on follow-ups for now, just so we can get to everybody.
Thank you. And actually, it's related to the question that Susan, that you just asked, so I thank you for that. One of the concerns I have is that if we are concerned about money and that playing a role, but we also at the same time make the threshold harder to reach, then that oftentimes will result in additional money. So, in my experience, again, in CD2, one of the things that we tried to do was go door to door. Your door-to-door petitioning, unlike an event or a public place, you get a much lower turnout. So it's not very fun for a volunteer to do that, and so campaigns resort to paying people. So if we're concerned about money, then I think we can't be too restrictive in other aspects, because the only people that will be able to get enough signatures from CD2 are the well-funded out-of-state programs.
I totally see where you're coming from. I think what I would say is the groups that are doing these professionally can certainly afford to drive 40 miles north and do it in Lewiston, Auburn instead of Portland exclusively. I think that is potentially a concern. It would be interesting to see how it played out. And perhaps that would warrant an analysis of what has happened in states like Nevada and some of these other states that do employ the congressional district method. I can't speak directly to has outside money increased in the states that have done this, but it would certainly be an interesting analysis to conduct anyway.
Hi, I'm Ron Balancier from Brewer. I have a couple of points, if I can, which goes to a few of these things. The geographic piece. A few, you cited a few referendum questions that got onto the ballot, things having to do with firearms, gun control, those kinds of things. You spoke a lot about the home care initiative. It got on the ballot, and it may have been, some of that stuff may have been a little geographically lopsided, but guess what? When we had the statewide vote, they got defeated. I think the people of Maine are pretty smart. Okay, so that's one point. Next thing is, I have worked on a lot of referendum campaigns, and you're right, it is not easy to get these things on the ballot. There are strict time limits. Sometimes these questions come up during the winter time, the dead of winter, freezing cold in Maine, and trying to get out and get signatures. There are no fairs and events, so you have to think about those time limits, all of the other restrictions, needing to get thousands of additional signatures to get them on the ballot. It is not easy already getting these things onto the ballot. Third, can you clarify your answer, please, about disapproving tax policy going to referendum? And the three, essentially, one was the Pileski initiative, but that was basically the Tabor twin, and then there were two Tabor initiatives that went to the ballot. I would assume now that you would have changed your position and you would not want those issues going to the ballot now.
As I mentioned before, I should have clarified in saying in terms of subject restriction, increasing taxes, not just tax policy itself. So you're absolutely right. There was, in 2006 was Tabor 1, in 2008 or 2009 was Tabor 2. I'm not familiar with the other one that you had mentioned, but we also haven't put forward there was a bill this session, I think, sponsored by Senator Timberlake that did that, which we supported, but we didn't approach him with that legislation. He put that in on his own, but I think the problem as it relates to that is, I mean, you need to think about what Tabor was doing. Tabor was trying to put spending limits on government equivalent with inflation and making it so tax increases had to be approved by voters directly. I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think the problem is that it's too easy, especially if you look at some of the stuff in the report that I wrote last year in terms of when these issues are brought to ballot and they're dominated primarily by out-of-state groups. I think you also need to keep in mind that a little over 40% of these don't even have formalized opposition. There's not even groups signed up with Maine Ethics Commission to oppose these things because there isn't an infinite number of special interest groups in Maine just waiting to combat a ballot initiative. You know what I mean? So I think that, I don't know specifically in terms of, you know, will the geographic requirements do it alone? Will it be a subject restriction? Will it be whatever? But I think, as I mentioned before, the influence of these outside groups isn't necessarily bad, but do we want them to be the ones driving the process? At the end of the day, Maine people do get to decide, but when you've heard this message 1,000 times over, because they have quite literally millions, multiple millions of dollars behind them, and the group opposing this hasn't raised a single penny because there isn't a group opposing this, how do you make that process more equitable? If you have $2.5 million and you want to convince somebody to do something and you have no opposition, I think you're failing if you don't convince everybody that your idea is the best.
If I could just jump in with two quick questions. I hate to be really blunt, Jake, but isn't it hypocritical to say that we shouldn't have tax increases go to referendum, but if you want a tax decrease, that could go to referendum?
It's not a tax decrease.
Well,
It wasn't a tax decrease.
Well, it's a spending decrease, so if its spending goes down, it can go to referendum, but if it's going to go up, it shouldn't go to referendum?
Spending can only increase with inflation. It's not decreasing spending. Spending can only increase with inflation.
Okay, the second question, we've talked a lot about funding. We can't restrict, under the Constitution, spending, but what if we limited it to a publicly funded system? Should we have public funding for referendums like we do for our campaigns through the Maine Clean Elections system? Would that be helpful?
What's interesting, and it hasn't gotten a lot of exposure in the media, but I believe the last couple sessions, Representative Patrick Corey has actually put in a bill to do this, to make it so the clean elections process also applies to the citizens initiative and people's veto process. That's not something that we would support because we don't support the original law in the first place, but it's something the state could look at anyway, because I don't know of any other states that do that. There may be, but that could be a direction to go in. Like I said, I don't think that we would support it, but the idea has been tossed around and it hasn't seemed to have gotten traction this session or last session.
I'm curious, Carroll, your thoughts if we went to a public funding system?
Yeah, the public funding issue on elections and so on, we don't take a stand on that one way or the other, but like Jake, I think you have to at least look at to see whether that has a practical issue, because there are times that there may be a significant part of the population that has a resistance against something or a positive, but there simply is no voice there for them. So that certainly would be a natural, but we wouldn't take a position against it one way or the other.
More questions?
A question right here.
Thank you. My name is John Schneck. I'm the chair of Veterans and Legal Affairs. I'm a state representative. And just, this is my own opinion, but Governor LePage vetoed 642 bills during his term in office. From 1917 till now, he's vetoed more bills than all the governors in the state in that 100-year period, over 100-year period. It's really interesting. And in my mind, the big issue is, why did we have all those referenda that showed up? Those referenda come to us, those people's initiatives come to us, because the legislature during that 8-year period was dysfunctional. And I think that the number of people's initiatives that appear on the ballot are an absolute direct function of dysfunctional government. What do you guys think?
I would agree with you on the initiatives that did appear before the legislature. Obviously we weren't proponents of Medicaid expansion, for example, but that one went through the legislature multiple times, and you're right, it was vetoed, 6 or 7 times? So I can understand that, but the problem is that's not true 100% of the time. I don't even know if it's true half of the time. It would be interesting to see, just to do an analysis of how many times has an initiative that appears on our ballot word for word been proposed as legislation in the Maine legislature, because the universal home care issue, for instance, that wasn't one that was debated in the Maine legislature over and over and over and over again and then sent to voters. That was specifically a special interest group, multiple special interest groups, trying to pass an initiative. So I see your point, and I think you're right that there are certainly instances where either there's dysfunction in government or something is vetoed, and then that's why it becomes a citizens' initiative. It'd be interesting to see what the actual breakdown is over the years of how many of these were initiated bills in the legislature that were passed and vetoed or failed multiple times, and the ones that are totally new. But what I would also say to your point, and this is just because I'm a fan of representative government, but if these things fail and you want them to pass instead, my response is, elect people who will get it done.
And I would say too, having been there, John, the situation, there's no doubt, it's irrefutable that some of that's a reaction to that, but I think it's also part of, I've lived in Maine most of my life, And this, what we're moving to, what we're becoming to is a divided state. And so what you had was a representation of, larger government and seeing the same problems, but the solutions being more government-oriented, and then Paul LePage representing more the rural, northern part of the state. And so it is conducive to that type of conflict. If you're going to resist that, it's just 50-50 or 51-49. So we are much more in a much more conducive environment to that type of conflict. And so the result of that certainly were a number of these issues.
Good evening. I'm Stephen Bro. I live in Bangor. Actually, John, I'm in your district, so be careful. Be very careful. I came tonight because I saw this on Facebook, and I've been listening as carefully as I can, taking some notes, pulling up some things. My view, Maine has 2 congressional districts, only 2. Therefore, 50% of the signature gathering for any citizens' referendum should come from each congressional district. For too long, Maine has been driven by the concentration of the population in the Portland area, completely ignoring the signature gathering and the will of the voters in CD2. That is not a representative form of government. Frankly, in CD2, you just need to work that much harder. Now, in terms of the public funding mechanism in place, I actually, believe it or not, kind of am in favor of that. You can contribute to that to an unlimited amount, all you want, but you don't get to decide what the issues are. You put it into a pot and then let people decide later. Now, let me give you just an example of the results of out-of-state funding interests. 2016, question 3. I'm sure most people in here are still familiar with that. Michael Bloomberg spent close to $11 million, including on polls and signature gathering. Gun owners of Maine and the NRA combined spent $1.1 million. The NRA actually used its savings account for gun rights activities for Maine to contribute about half of that. The rest of that was raised by grassroots efforts right here in the state of Maine. But it's a 10-to-1 margin of outspending by out-of-state interests. The Bear referendum in 2014 was much the same way. It was an 8-to-1 split, out-of-state money versus in-state.
Was there a question in there?
More of a state. Well, thank you for that, Mr. Rowe. I just want to remind everyone that we're here to be civil, and when you tell someone that they need to be careful, that's bordering on a threat. And I'd appreciate if we can all just have a conversation, disagree when we disagree, but not threaten each other. And I hope we all can adhere to that as we move forward.
Thank you. My name is Sheila Zaman. I live in Herman. On the federal level, when legislation is proposed, the Congressional Budget Office looks at the impact on tax increases, increased spending, and they're considered a neutral party. I'm new to Maine, so I don't know if Maine legislature has the same thing. And it certainly sounds like that doesn't exist when assessing citizen initiatives. And one idea would be, if you want to get into the realm of public funding at all, it would be to pay for a neutral party impact analysis of the citizen initiatives, so that it isn't just how much money from whatever source is on either side of the argument, so that people actually know the impact.
So we actually do have one of those. It's called the Office of Fiscal and Program Review. So they will be the ones they do fiscal notes for every bill, whether it's a bill sponsored by a legislator or if it's something that is an initiated bill through the initiative and referendum process, there is an analysis done on those. So yes, it's called the Office of Fiscal and Program Review.
Yeah, it's just not as thorough as the Office of Management of Budget. Yeah.
They probably have 1/100th of the staff of the
Right.
CBO, if I had to take a guess.
Right. Senator Gratwick had a question, if someone can get a microphone over to him.
I can speak loud.
Okay.
Jeff Ratliff from Bangor. Question really for you, Susan. Why did you choose the particular makeup of two fairly conservative organization representatives for this particular group here?
We did ask other groups to participate, and they were not able to join us.
Thank you. I commend the basic impartiality of what's going on here, which I think is very appropriate and very useful. But on the other hand, I wish others had been able to come as well.
We do as well. Do we have other questions?
Yes, hi. My name is Hank Garfield. I'm a resident and voter here in Bangor, and I have a comment and a question on the ranked choice voting issue and the way it affects the two congressional districts. My comment is that in the most recent congressional district election, ranked choice voting worked exactly the way it was designed to do. We had an incumbent who was extremely unpopular with half the electorate, and we ended up with a, dare I say, centrist who was more palatable to more of the electorate in a divided district. So it did what it was intended to do. Was also voted twice by the people of Maine. My question, I'm going to use the words urban and rural kind of loosely, but just for the sake of simplicity. My question is, given that the U.S. Congress is a national office whose members vote on national policy, and given that rural areas are already overrepresented through the makeup of the U.S. Senate and the Electoral College, does not requiring X number of signatures on an issue like ranked choice voting in both congressional districts, does that not exacerbate the problem of overrepresentation of rural areas at the expense of urban areas?
So I don't, first of all, I had a class with you. I don't know if you remember, but I don't, what'd you say?
Nice to see you.
Yes, you too. I don't think it results in overrepresentation. And the reason why I say that is because there would have to be 10% of the votes cast for governor in both congressional districts. So it would be an equal amount. As Susan had mentioned before, the congressional district method is used, and you can't use county, for instance, because there aren't equal amounts of people in each. So theoretically, the congressional districts are supposed to be totally even. They're not. There's obviously a slight disparity between the two. There's a little more people in CD1 than CD2, but I don't think it's over-representative because it's the same threshold in both districts.
Yeah, and I would agree that it doesn't even necessarily parallel the federal. And if you were actually saying that equal amounts from both district or from the Senate districts, I don't know how that is over-representation. When you were actually starting with a 10% or 15% threshold, if you're getting it the same from everyone, I don't know how that's over-representation. That's equal representation.
Just to clarify a couple things, Mr. Rowe has informed me that his comment was related to the fact that he might be challenging Representative Check at some point. It wasn't meant as a threat. It was meant as an electoral threat, not a physical threat. So I just want to clarify that for everyone. So maybe a campaign announcement here in the works. That's a first to one of these. Okay. And also wanted to clarify to Senator Gratwick's question. We had someone else who was also interested, and it wasn't just that they weren't available. I missed a call from them, and it spiraled from there. And they were willing to participate. But so that one's actually on me. Just to clarify, there was some willingness from other groups as well. But I'm very happy that our two speakers have chosen to join us. And I don't know if anybody else has some questions. We're getting close to 7 o'clock, but somebody who hasn't spoken yet.
Ed Grahowski from Ellsworth. two parts, kind of. One is that you keep talking about the dark money coming in, and yet you seem to be opposed to clean elections. Isn't that kind of like a contradiction? I'd like to hear more on that. And item number two is, you say representative government. How is it that we get a governor with 38%? That means 62% of the people said, not you. How are you calling that a representative government? 50% or more is what decides in democratically. Why doesn't Maine put the Constitution back the way it was in 1820 when we became a state until it got changed in the 1880s for simplicity, cost. We have cars now. We don't have to get buckboards or on horses to go vote. Please.
To the second point, I mean, whoops, is this on or off? To the second point, I mean, the Constitution says plurality, so I don't. To be honest with you, I don't know what I can do about it.
That's where you threw in.
But
you threw in.
Well, I didn't throw it in. I'm only 24 years old. I wasn't alive in 1880. But to your point about the dark money and clean elections, I totally contend that clean elections aren't clean elections. The requirement that you have to, and now we're in issues more so than the ballot initiative process, but to entertain your question, the way that works with the disclosures of your three top funders is you create 3 PACs or 3 ballot question committees or however many you want, and you call them Mainers for this, Mainers for that, and Mainers for the other thing. And then when one group takes money from an outside group and funnels it through 3, 4, 5 other groups, and their top funders are Mainers for this, Mainers for that, Mainers for the other thing, that's not clean elections. That's just distributing money through different political channels to make dark money look like clean money.
I think you're giving us disinformation. Clean election money comes from individuals signing and donating $5.
Right, sorry, I was...
You're saying you have dark corporations running around handing out $5 bills all over the place?
No.
I want to see that money.
I'm sorry, I was talking specifically about the disclosure requirements within the clean elections law. You're right, you get $5 contributions, there's a fund, and then you get more signatures, you get more money. Right.
Make it even for everybody to run in Maine. That's the democratic way to go. I understand your dark money, and I agree. Too much is way too much. Let the initiative, let the people do it.
Liberal, we got another question back here.
My name's Judy Harrison, and yes, I work for the Bangor Daily News, but I've been in Maine since 1984, and twice I have voted for referendums to fund education at 55%, and we still are not there yet. What needs to be done to make sure that once we vote on something in a referendum or a people's veto, that it's implemented?
Go ahead, Josh.
That's a tough one, because that one's been on the books for a while and we haven't get there. I don't know if you want me to speak specifically to that issue or just in general. It kind of ties into what I had mentioned before in terms of if we had public hearings and there were competing measures or whatever. You have to realize at the end of the day that most of these questions that we're voting on were written by an interest group. So I think that for laws to be implemented as, the legislature wishes, if they took that front end step of holding the hearing and having a competing measure, we would have laws that actually get implemented after they're passed by voters instead of changing them or just having a law on the books that is, I wouldn't say impossible, because the first couple of years after it went into effect, we were very, very close to 55%, and since then we've kind of waned away from it. But I think that if you have that front-end engagement from the legislature, that these things would be easier to handle.
And then that's an example, even though this is far from my organization's mission, but you think about even what is 55%, what is the definition of 55% that voters thought they were talking about that has never really been, defined, even amongst folks that totally, support the proposition.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions before we wrap it up. So.
Thank you. John Schneck again. The bar to change the referendum process in the state of Maine requires a 2/3 vote in the legislature. One of the things we tossed around in this last legislature is there a point? It's pretty widely known that the population of the second CD is dwindling, and in one of the next census or two, it's very possible that we might be a one CD state. So is it worth all the trouble to go and change this referendum process for a state that might become a one CD state? Now, the other side of that is that the Constitution of the state of Maine gives us two ways to legislate. It's not just the legislature. They said that the people can legislate. They gave us a lay legislature. I'm not a professional politician. I'm a layperson. And everyone else in the legislature is a layperson. In fact, in Maine, we're probably almost the most poorly paid legislature in the country. So they give us another way to legislate as well, and that's the people's referendum. And that process has worked. The casino didn't make it. The bear baiting bill didn't make it. Tabor didn't make it. There are a whole bunch of bills. In fact, Governor LePage tried to get enough signatures to eliminate the income tax, and they gave up. So that process has worked pretty good for about 100 years. And the other thing is that there's nowhere in the Constitution of the state of Maine that gives the signature across the state, one man, one vote, one man, one signature. Why should that signature be worth any more in the second CD than it is across the state? So it doesn't exist in the Constitution that signatures should be weighted. It's one man, one vote, one man, one signature, no matter where you live in the state of Maine. That's what the Constitution gives us. What do you think?
John, I don't understand how having even distribution weights something. That's why I think the congressional system just isn't going to work because of our demographics. And even if it shifts, then it still needs to be evenly, as far as the congressional district. One shouldn't be more than the other. But I still don't understand the proposition that somehow this weights something more when you're saying the same percentage has to come from every geographic district or senatorial district. I honestly don't understand how that weights something more when you're actually demanding that it be even.
And the only thing I would say is you're right. I have no idea. I mean, 20 years from now, what will certainly our congressional districts are going to change. I don't know if it'll be a one state or not. But I think that's why there are alternative methods out there that can be explored. Theoretically, our state senate districts are also supposed to be drawn evenly. Now, as we said before, that's a much higher threshold than just having to go up to Lewiston, Auburn, or Bangor, or some of the larger metro areas, if that's what you want to call it up here. But I don't think that should dissuade us from enacting good policy, and I believe that it's good policy.
All right, one last question, and then once we're done, hopefully, I don't think, Zach, you're not going to kick us out right at 7, right? So folks want to hang out, keep the conversation going in smaller groups. Definitely encourage that.
I will open the door.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for keeping it simple.
Thank you. I appreciate that last comment about civility because I want to thank the whole room for what I think was largely a civil conversation and for the BDN for hosting this conversation because it is so important that we discuss these issues. And one thing that stuck out to me that seems like a theme and that was stated by Carroll was that we're becoming a divided state. And I think that's something that a lot of us are working really hard to prevent. And I just want to say, I should have said earlier, I'm the representative from Ellsworth. And I actually think that there's a misconception about how divided we are. We have more bills that pass with unanimous consent than we ever vote on. But that's not something that the media reports. We have these sort of conversations in our committee work, and that's really the brunt of where the legislation gets done. And I think in Maine we should be very proud that our state is actually working a lot better than our federal government is working better than a lot of other states. And the one thing that I don't want to see is any kind of policy that seeks to divide us, whether it divides us by party, whether it divides us geographically. We need to stay one state of Maine and keep that point of reference because that's the only way that we can have civil conversations across the state. So that's why I'm an advocate for just leaving the geographic distribution it is, because it's one Maine where one people would get one vote. That's how I see it. And I just want everyone to know that that's a lot of how the legislature actually operates.
Thank you. Jake and Carroll, if you have any final thoughts, and as Matt said, hopefully folks will stick around and we'll continue to have a less formal discussion.
No, thank you to BDN, thank you to Nocturnem, and I'm happy to chat with anybody afterwards.
And I would just say something as I go around the state, I've been doing this since July of 2010. I was a civics history teacher, had a pretty good idea how the government works, but for those, the familiar faces here, whether you've got a D or an R or an I by your name, I constantly tell people, anybody that is halfway conscientiously trying to represent their folks back home in Augusta, the average person has no idea the sacrifices you make to be away from your home and how hard you work and the hours. And I constantly tell the people in Maine, whether I agree with you politically or not on these issues, how much I appreciate how hard our legislators work. And I want you to know that publicly.
And Val has one quick point.
I kept my mouth shut while everybody was asking questions. I thought they were wonderful questions. And a lot of the questions that you're asking about alternatives and everything are ones that we're looking at what's happening in a lot of other states throughout the U.S. because the League of Women Voters has done this type of study in many other states, particularly California, Washington, Oregon, which have a very, very big program. So I'd just like to encourage you to visit our website. We don't have the report on there yet, but keep in touch with what we're doing because I think we're going to add to trying to figure out what would work in Maine and what wouldn't through this study. Thank you.
I want to thank Jake and Carroll for sharing this little couch with me. We're all really hot, but we've had a great discussion. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I think we did have a really good discussion, and one thing I heard loud and clear is that Maine's referendum process is really important to all of you. We might disagree on how it should be done, what the signature gathering should look like, but everybody agrees it's a really important aspect of our democracy. And in the name of unity, I think that's something that we should keep in mind, that there's a lot of agreement in this room, even though we disagree about some of the aspects. So thank you all again for coming. Thanks to Nocturnem, and don't forget to tip Zach very well for keeping you fed and in beer or whatever you chose to drink. And we hope to see you at future Bangor Daily Brews events. And please, if you have ideas for issues that we should talk about, people you'd like to have a discussion with, send us an email because we'd love to get your input. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.